As everyone in this room will know, the Indo-Pacific, as a free, open, and largely rules-based region, is coming under increased pressure from an aggressive, assertive, and revisionist China that sees the post-war order not as a good faith effort to create and grow institutions that are in the interests of all, but instead as a Western-inspired scheme to keep China from its rightful place as the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific and perhaps even globally. From the Himalayas to the South and East China Sea and beyond, little effort is required to bring to mind all the ways in which Xi Jinping's China currently falls short as a responsible stakeholder in the post-war, rules-based international order. Such behavior has raised trepidation around what is perhaps China's most ambitious project, the Belton Road Initiative, a multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure initiative that reaches across Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia. The world has yet to figure out how to deal with this new era of Chinese power, especially following the United States' ill-advised and highly regrettable decision to withdraw from the TPP. But one important development has been the return of the Quad, a loose coalition of democracies involving Japan, the United States, India, and Australia. When it was first proposed by the Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007, the Quad was probably ahead of its time. Today, by contrast, its time has clearly come. The Quad represents the most important avenue to ensure the Indo-Pacific remains free and open to all countries, and is perhaps the most cohesive strategic response to China's rise. From Canada's point of view, however, the Quad leaves us on the sidelines, as opposed to taking up our rightful place as an emerging Indo-Pacific power. This is not to suggest that Canada has been in any way excluded, but rather that Canada has yet to move from ambition to real action and commitment in the Indo-Pacific. We have not yet been taken seriously because we do not yet take ourselves seriously as a major player in the region. At present, Canada's role in the Indo-Pacific is, as the Americans say, all hat and no cattle. The government should see the growing discussions around a Quad to be a heaven-sent opportunity to begin to change that. By reimagining the Quad as a concert with Canada as an integral member, we could assert a bold claim as a power in the region. Canada can and should become an indispensable partner in this effort. So we're very lucky indeed to have in our panel some of the world's leading minds to explore the Quad and the future of Indo-Pacific cooperation. Our first speaker who will set the scene for this event is Dr. Satoru Nagao. Dr. Nagao is currently a visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, in addition to being a research fellow at both the Japan Forums for Strategic Studies and the Security and Strategy Research Institute for Japan, amongst other affiliations. Dr. Nagao is an expert on US, Japan, and India security cooperation and has authored numerous books and articles on this issue. He also writes for a column called Age of Japan-India Alliance at Nikkei Business, the journal of one of Japan's leading newspapers. His talk will be followed by our keynote speaker, Dr. Edward Litvak, a renowned strategist who I think among scholars and practitioners of defense and strategic policy needs no introduction. Dr. Litvak is senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, not to be confused with our CSIS, in Washington, and has consulted widely with a number of governments and international organizations. He is author of Strategy, The Logic of War and Peace, and The Rise of China versus the Logic of Strategy. After these two talks, a panel discussion will then take place, moderated by MLI's Shuvaloy Majumdar, Munk Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy, and acting head of our new Center for Promoting Canada's Interests Abroad. There, our first two speakers will be joined by Dr. Mohan Malik, professor at the U.S. Department of Defense's Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, and Dr. Jim Mudaliar, special advisor to Maritime Forces Pacific. Lastly, I want to thank the Embassy of Japan and Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their generous support of this event. I'm delighted that the ambassador, Kimihiro Ishikani, has taken the time out of his busy schedule to attend. Ambassador Ishikani has held foreign postings as Ambassador of Japan to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, and Minister at the Embassy of Japan in the United States, in addition to having served as Deputy Vice Minister for Foreign Policy, Director General in various bureaus, and Executive Assistant to the Prime Minister of Japan. The Ambassador has kindly consented to say a few words of welcome, and so I would invite him to join me at the podium. Ambassador.
Well, good morning, Mr. Crowley, distinguished panelists, guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to attend today's panel discussion on security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for bringing this event together and for providing the platform for this timely discussion. I would also like to thank all the panelists, many of you flying all the way to Ottawa, for sharing your ideas and engaging in this dialogue. As we will be listening to some very interesting conversation in a short moment, I will make my remarks brief. Well, Japan and Canada are celebrating the 90th anniversary of diplomatic relations this year. The Japanese embassy and 4 consulates general across the country are organizing a wide range of events to commemorate this milestone. Well, today's event, I believe, is a very good opportunity to think about a very important agenda of today, but also provide us opportunity to think about Japan-Canada relations in a broader context and to expand our cooperation at the regional and international levels, especially facing the latest challenges to the rule-based international order. Well, yes, the key point here is rule-based order. We need to maintain, promote, and improve economic and strategic international institutions that have the rule of law as their core. In conjunction with the theme of today's discussion, it is Japan's priority to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific that is of vital importance, not only for the stability and prosperity of the region, but also for the world. As such, we pretty much welcome the recent signing of the CPTPP agreement by 11 countries across the Pacific, including Canada. A free and open Indo-Pacific region is meant to be a public common good that should be protected by all the countries and players that enjoy its benefits. However, like-minded countries that are committed to common values such as democracy, rule of law, human rights, free trade, and market economy are probably in the best position to maintain and preserve this order. At the same time, I must add that given the stern geopolitical realities, the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific has to be backed up by hard power so that the long-term sustainability and the resilience of the region can be ensured. This reality is a reminder about the pivotal role that the United States plays on many fronts. Toward this end, I very much look forward to hearing expert analyses from the outstanding panel, and I hope today's discussion will shed light on how cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region could be strengthened. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I wish you all an excellent panel discussion. Thanks.
Yes, let me join the ambassador in thanking our panelists for traveling in some cases from quite far away, and I think all of us want to particularly extend our sympathies to Mohan Malik, who's come from Hawaii. I do apologize.
It's a nice change.
Liar. Be that as it may, I'd now like to ask Dr. Nagao to take the stage and offer his remarks. Dr. Nagao, welcome.
Thank you very much for giving a chance to make presentation just before the Edward Litvak. So everyone in this place wants to listen the lecture of the Edward Litvak, not me. So I'm very looking forward to hear from him, but I should not waste the time so long time. But could you give me the 10 minutes before this? This is a relax time. This is a rest between the ambassador and Edward Litvak. So let's take the cake and coffee or tea now. But enjoy my presentation. I wish. Okay. My title of my presentation is this place. Why Japan needs Japan, US, Australia, India security cooperation. Maybe everyone know before the event because you can see the display. So now, today, further security cooperation of the Japan, US, Australia, India is increasingly plausible. Like that. Like that. Like that. So I want to ask, and we want to ask, why? In case of Japan, changing security situation has pushed Japan to do so. So there are 3 questions. Why? What kind of change has occurred around Japan? To address the situation, what kind of security system we are seeking? And what can Japan, US, Australia, India cooperation do? So what change have occurred around Japan? This slide shows. Nowadays, China has started to expand their military activities around Japan. The figure shows the route that China is using around Japan. So red lines. So the area of their military activities has been expanding from first island chain, the green line you can see, to the second island chain, also green line, which are the defense line of China. In the air, the number of scramble against Chinese military aircraft was increased in 851 times in the annual year 2016. So simply said, we have too many guests to deal with. So in addition, China's military activities has also been very aggressive in South China Sea, Indo-China border area, or Indian Ocean. And now China holds joint exercises with Russia in the Baltic Sea. Why China's assertiveness has intensified so much lately? If history may be referred to, the tendency of China's expansion has based on military balance. When France, United States, Soviet Union withdrew from South China Sea, China occupied island and reefs which both Philippines and Vietnam claimed. Therefore, the need to exist for us to maintain a military balance with China. How to achieve that? We need new security system. To adjust the situation, what kind of security system we are seeking? For a long time, hub and spoke system have maintained order in the Indo-Pacific. Under this system, both Japan and Australia are US allies, but Japan and Australia share no close security relations. So thus, this system is heavily dependent on US military power. However, the salient feature of the recent security situation is changing US-China military balance. Unfortunately, for example, during the 2000 to 2060, the US commissioned 14 new submarines, 14. During the same period, China commissioned 43 submarines. So US allied and friendly countries need to fill the power vacuum to maintain military balance. So as a result, you can see the new security framework has emerged. The framework is security network of US allies and friendly countries. This cooperation includes not only US-led cooperation, but also Japan, Australia, India, or India, Australia, Indonesia, or Japan, UK, Japan, France, and Japan, Canada, which do not include United States. So Japan, Australia, India cooperation will be key in this case. So what can Japan, US, Australia, India cooperation do? Because of the geographical location, for example, if India cooperates with Japan and the United States, India will not need to deal with all the Chinese fighter jets at once because China is likely to keep some of their fighter jets in their east side against Japan-US force, and vice versa. So India's naval rise help lower heavy burden of Japan, US, Australia in the Indian Ocean. Japan, US, Australia, India can collaborate to support Southeast Asian countries around South China Sea, both militarily and economically, through the capacity building of armed force or the infrastructure development project. So now, as a conclusion, just before the big speech. Nowadays, China has started to expand their military activities around Japan. The reason is related with the changing US-China military balance. US allies and friendly countries now require a new security framework to adjust the situation. And in the security framework, Japan, US, Australia, India security cooperation will be key. So we should send a message to China, you are strong but not so strong. Without cooperate with us, China's aid will not come. This is a message of Quad cooperation. So the time has come to proactively further Japan, US, Australia, India, and of course Canada will join, the cooperation to ensure the proper stability in the full Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nagao, for that wonderful scene-setting talk. It's now the turn of Edward Litvak. Before I invite Dr. Litvak to the podium, let me just say that MLI has the great privilege of enjoying a very close relationship, if I can put it that way, with Dr. Litvak, which comes about not in the first instance because of our shared interest in public policy, but because Dr. Litvak phoned me one day and said, I have a young student who I really want to find an internship for, and he's not allowed to come to the United States. Will you take him as an intern? And we did, and had a wonderful experience with him. We had him for basically a year, and we were very sorry to lose him. And so Dr. Litvak has made, in that way and in many others, a signal contribution to the Institute. He's also been an author of papers for us, and we're in the midst of trying to put together a project to collaborate with him on the issues that he's about to speak to you about this morning. Dr. Litvak, would you join us, please?
My starting point is Canada's role during the Cold War. During the Cold War, we all confronted a formidable Soviet Union. We should not remember it in its last declining days. It was a formidable entity. We confronted it successfully without conflict, at least not in Europe. And Canada's role was disproportionately large. There was a full armored brigade in Lahr, Germany. I actually visited that brigade, and they were kind enough to let me drive a tank, which is great fun, you know. Although I, wanted to continue driving it and so on, but, Canada's contribution of a brigade, which was, by the way, a very large brigade, was only a small part of its contribution in that sense because of the fact that Canadian officers had the disproportionate role in the overall NATO structure. That was due partly because some were French-speaking, and there was always the delicate issue of keeping the Belgians, the French involved, and secondly because of their fact that they were Americans without being American, which is a big advantage in NATO. Now, the Canadian Navy, on the other hand, played a very important role in the crucial naval role at the time, which was anti-submarine warfare. Surface craft anti-submarine warfare, again, disproportionate. Canadian Air Force was a significant part of the NATO Air Force. This was an engagement that Canada sustained without suffering any casualties at a tolerable cost, which made a major contribution. If I now see what Canada is doing on the Atlantic side, extending to the Mediterranean and Middle East, I see a series of engagement in peacekeeping operations and things of that sort, all of which have the characteristic of failing. All of them fail. None of them succeed. As you know, the amount of peace in that part of the world has declined, not increased. Peacekeeping operations have contributed a lot to this war, because anytime there's a winner and a loser, the peacekeepers step in, they help the losers against the winners, so the war can now continue for another 72 years. So from a serious engagement in the global security through the Canadian engagement in NATO in the Cold War, an important role politically, militarily, goes into this kind of Boy Scout adventurism and so on. The only thing retained is the quality of the forces themselves. It's not by accident that the world record holder for sniping is a Canadian soldier from TF2. His record is 3,500 meters. I'm a shooter myself, and I want to tell you that 3,500 meters, a house looks like a small nail. But this gentleman, peacekeeper, was not shooting at the house. He was shooting at one of the people to be kept in peace, who he sent to us, and he was shooting at 3,500 meters when he looks like one of those no-see-them black flies, okay? So the armed forces of Canada retained their quality in operational tactical term. However, they're entirely misapplied in things that cannot succeed. When you, for example, send troops to Mali, I can tell you what the outcome will be. There'll be some people will get killed, some Malians, some Canadians maybe, and at the end of it, people will say, why the hell did we ever go to Mali? And did any of the people who had ever sent them to Mali had ever visited Mali? You know, these things are done with less care than a Canadian plans his winter holidays. You know, they go in the winter, they look at Cuba, Florida, whatever. The amount of real deliberation is much less when you send troops. Now, on the Pacific side, on the other hand, there is a great deficit. You've heard a very, very interesting, symmetrical, very clear, sharp analysis there. What there is called a strategic deficit. There is not enough strategic power in order to achieve with China what was achieved with the Soviet Union, namely handle the rise of a power, a formidable power, without conflict and have a good outcome. And there is a Canadian absence. There are, of course, ships in the Pacific side for Canada, a couple of ships, nothing much, nothing resembling a shadow of what was Canada on the Atlantic side during the decades of the Cold War. Nothing resembling in terms of weight and importance. Now, what Canada could achieve is exemplified by Australia. The Australians have not suffered casualties. They haven't spent inordinate amounts of money. But their role in bringing about this architecture, which was very ably explained, which is a balancing architecture, was a very important one. Because in China's rise evokes very naturally, automatically, organically, a balancing coalition. To maintain the balance is very normal. However, somebody has to go and do the connectivity. Prime Minister of Japan did a lot of connectivity, but it was Chinese behavior that drove everybody together. There were some, but still governments and diplomats had to work. And what the Australians did, for example, was they brought in the Malaysians. The Malaysians don't talk to anybody except the Australians. The Australians they periodically visit the base in Butterworth. In Malaysia, there's still, by the way, a one-star British general who has some residual 5-power agreement duties. He shows up at Pacific meetings and so on. As you know, the British are still building an aircraft carrier. The only possible destination on that aircraft carrier is Singapore. There is no possible use for a large aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean. You know, if you want to chase the Islamic State with an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean, good luck to you. But apart from the foolishness of calling a couple of guys running around as a state, the fact is that this aircraft carrier will either not be built or will end up in Singapore. So what's happening is that the strategic center has simply moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific, in spite of Mr. Putin's attempts to have fun and games in Crimea and Ukraine. There is no engagement there because, as you know, the European Union is not responding strategically. They're just not. None of these governments are willing to do anything. They're willing to talk, but they're not willing to send 12 soldiers. There are plenty of soldiers in Western Europe who are eating pasta in their barracks, macaroni and Wurster, and none of them have been sent to the Ukraine where their presence might moderate things. So nothing's going to happen there. What could happen in the Pacific if the Canadian military engagement, without increasing in overall magnitude, goes from the irrelevant part to the relevant part of the world, they could have a stabilizing role there. Now, and a connectivity role. As I said, the Australians, big contribution, they brought in the Malaysians, who wouldn't talk to anybody else. They also brought in the Indonesians to some degree. And to the one country that was missed in the previous presentation, which is a stalwart member of this emerging alliance, and that's Vietnam. The Australians began a strategic dialogue, so-called, with the Vietnamese before the Americans were talking with them. Their strategic dialogue was an intelligence dialogue. And what I would say Chinese foreign policy has achieved the fact that the Vietnamese are now, impatiently waiting for the next visit of a U.S. aircraft carrier task force in Haiphong Harbor. 10 years ago, the U.S. Navy asked if they could come into the shelter of the harbor because there was a terrible typhoon and there was a loose destroyer. The Vietnamese said, we would like to, but we can't. It's too this and to that. Now, they wouldn't take in a destroyer for 24 hours. Now they invite aircraft carrier task forces. Now this, again, the Australians played a crucial role. It's a kind of role Canada is very well fit to play with a strong diplomatic tradition. What did they do? They started talking strategy, threats, and security to Vietnam years before anybody else did. They have a regular dialogue where the Vietnamese go there and the Australians go there. So Canada could do the role of Australia in diplomatic terms. And secondly, now that the Canadian Navy is unemployed on the Atlantic side, it has really nothing to do, unless they go all the way to Somalia to hunt the remaining 2 pirates who are justifying large fleets now deployed in anti-piracy. There are about 3 pirates and 50 ships to deal with them. They can send 51 if they want. Alternatively, they can move them to the Pacific. I'm told, I've never been there, that the Pacific coast of Canada is not very ugly. And it should not be pleasant. And what would be the role for such a navy? It's very simple: to uphold the freedom of navigation, fundamental principle for the commons of the globe, to have freedom of navigation. That would be the role. Not against China, not against anybody else. Final point: Canada does a lot of business with China, and Australia does more business with China. And this has been another Australian role. Periodically, the Chinese publicly declare or privately declare how you cannot afford to be part of an anti-China coalition. You need our business. And the Australians, this provides the opportunity for successive Australian prime ministers to do what they'd like to do, which is our foreign ministers, to stand up and say our foreign policy is not for sale, which sends a good message to the whole region, and it's duly noted. So these are all roles Canada could play, and in order to achieve all this, you don't need to spend more money, you don't need to do much of anything other than to do the hardest thing of all, which is to change mentalities, because the whole Canadian diplomatic foreign policy establishment on that is still, I guess they watch a lot of BBC shows about the British Empire and the Crown or whatever it is. They're still wedded to the notion that, the British might need us to land in Dieppe, once again, that kind of stuff, but it's simply a cultural orientation. And this needs to be changed. These things are not easily achieved. I myself live in Washington, D.C., where we have 97% of the inhabitants of the U.S. government, State Department, CIA, and everything else, who know the name of every village in Iraq. And they don't know that South America exists. Latin America, which is for us commercially much more important, source of immigration, source of tourism, place where Americans go, source of good things and bad things, nobody in Washington gives a damn. Every village in Afghanistan rates more attention than Argentina. Mosul, my God, much more important than Brazil. So these cultural orientations are not easy to change. But this is the reason why a think tank, people who are supposed to lead thought, have a central role in this. It was simply to take people by the nose and say to them, look, Canada has a Pacific coastline. And, Canada has a Navy. So that's where the Canadian Navy should be. That's where the Canadian Air Force should be. And not in the Atlantic where they're now sadly unemployed. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Litvak. As a native British Columbian, I can attest to the fact that the West Coast is particularly beautiful and would benefit from a greater naval presence. So now that we have had the scene so ably set by our two kickoff speakers, I would like to invite MLI's Monk Senior Fellow in Foreign Affairs, Shuvaloy Majumdar, to come to the stage and moderate our panel discussion. Shu, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Crowley. I'd like to invite our panelists and presenters to take a chair with me on the podium here, on the dais, on the stools. And I'd like to first of all welcome Dr. Mohan Malik to offer some comments and interventions on the topics we've heard already this morning. We're very happy to have him here. We actually taped a podcast with him yesterday. Dr. Malik is one of the most renowned scholars when it comes to the Indo-Pacific security issues, publishing numerous books, and most recently at Macdonald-Laurier. Dr. Malik, please come.
Thank you. Thanks for that very generous introduction, and it's really a nice change of weather for me from Hawaii, where I'm used to, only one season, 12 months of the year. Let me start off by saying that it's good that the Quad is back. Quad 2.0 is back. Unlike the Quad 1.0 that was put together in 2006 and pushed by Prime Minister Abe and Dick Cheney, didn't survive partly because of Australia's defection in 2008 from the Quad. Unlike the old Quad, this Quad has grassroots support. Ironically, unlike most things made in China, I would say that this Quad has been made possible because of China. The PLA has worked very hard over the last 10 years to bring this Quad together. So credit goes to China for bringing this Quad together. And unlike most things that are made in China, this Quad is going to have a longer shelf life. The bad news is that this Quad 2.0 is more than a decade old. If the Quad had survived, I'm pretty sure that China would have been deterred from creating fake islands in the South China Sea, artificial islands, militarizing them, and posing such a challenge to laws, norms, and institutions of the liberal democratic order that has existed since the end of the Cold War, the World War II, I would say, going back. What we are seeing today is not just, in one or Cambodia or Maldives, where or Sri Lanka, wherever China goes to invest. Democracy is the collateral damage from Chinese investments in those countries. So there's a clash of values going on between OBOR, One Belt, One Road, and the Quad group of countries. MLI has recently published my two-part piece on the China-India nautical games in the Indian Ocean, where I argue that the Quad is a regional effort. It's for the Indo-Pacific. But China is today a global power. China is investing in Africa, Latin America, Central Asia. European Union is faced with the same challenge that ASEAN is faced with in Southeast Asia. China is setting up this institution, 16+1 in Europe, for example, Greece is acting like Cambodia in terms of sabotaging EU's resolution on human rights violations in the UN. That's what Cambodia did to prevent ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries' unity on the South China Sea. So there's a broader clash of values going on, with China now trying to export its model of governance to the rest of the world. So the challenge is much bigger. It's not just confined to the Asia-Pacific or to the Indo-Pacific. Efforts like this, quads, trilats, minilaterals, they need to be reinforced, supported at the global level by concert of democracies or coalition of democracies. I would call it QUAD, to support, reinforce the regional quads or trilats or minilats that are coming up. And that's where Canada, European Union, New Zealand, other countries can chip in, can support, reinforce those efforts that are taking place at the regional levels. Regimes that do not abide by the rule of law in domestic politics, do not share power with other political parties in domestic politics, do not constrain the exercise of power in domestic politics, will never abide by the rule of law in international politics, will not share power with other major powers in international politics. Most of the assumptions underlying China policy over the last 3-4 decades in both Western and Asian capitals have turned out to be wrong assumptions, mainly because, fundamentally flawed assumptions, mainly because they were based on wrong assumptions. A policy prescription is as sound as the assumptions on which it is based. If fundamental assumptions underlying that policy are wrong, unsound, then that policy prescription is going to lead to where we are today with respect to China. We all expected China to change. We did not expect China. Many China experts, I would draw your attention to Dr. Litvak's book, The Rise of China and the Logic of Strategy. Many China experts made wrong assumptions about China's future. And that's what has brought us to where we are. And the challenge is a global one, and we need efforts of all countries in this to reinforce, to maintain a free and open democratic order at the global level, not just at the Indo-Pacific level. I'll start there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Dr. Malik, please take a chair. Have a seat. I'd like to now invite Dr. Jim Mudaliar to share some of his comments and perspectives of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific at the same quality and intimate detail that he would offer to the commander of the Maritime Forces Pacific. Please feel unvarnished. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And let me congratulate the MLI on this remarkable undertaking to have a Wednesday morning in the middle of winter in Ottawa and to have a full house in this wonderful drawing room. It reminds me of Salon from the 18th century, but these issues are remarkably important, and the educative role of MLI is to be commended. A couple of observations, if I may go back to basics. First of all, for Professor Litvak, I do come from the West Coast, and I do work for the Navy. I would suggest to you that there's a profoundly Columban worldview that prevails in Ottawa, that you go to Victoria and you fall off the edge of the earth. That Asia is in the all too difficult file. That all of our links societally and organizationally lead back across the Atlantic. Economically, they lead north and south into the United States, and Asia is in many ways an afterthought. I would suggest further that Ottawa's capacity for self-delusion and self-congratulation is in inverse proportion to its real accomplishments. What we're witnessing now, sadly, is Canada Light. And I'm not sure whether other people around the world are being fooled, but we should not be fooled. Let me go back to basics in terms of the topic today. I would suggest to you that what we're thinking about, perhaps subconsciously, are a series of breathtakingly profound developments. Firstly, embedded in the meteoric rise of the Chinese economy over 4 decades was the discovery of sea power. And I don't say that simply as a student of naval affairs. It's just that traditionally the Chinese always viewed the sea as a barrier. Existential threats in China originated out of the interior of Asia. What we've seen, however, is that with remarkable rapidity, the Chinese have become true converts to the work of the great American navalist Alfred Mahan. And Mahan, in a word, said that great nations have great navies. And the Chinese have embraced this truism wholeheartedly. And in the past third of the century, the Chinese have built over 330, I say again, over 330 warships of different sizes, shapes, and designs, whether submarines, or aircraft carriers, patrol craft, destroyers, and so forth. One can only compare that to the building rate here in Canada, and I leave you to explore that on your own. So what we've discovered is that the Chinese are now looking at the sea in a profoundly different way than they did before. And that the great competitions, the contestation which is pending, is between the United States, which projects its power and influence largely through maritime assets, and a rising China. And that increasingly it's the oceans of the world, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, that are the arenas where this is going to be played out. And as I was saying to my old and dear friend, Dr. Malik, just when we were in the foyer before this session, it strikes me that the Indo-Pacific is a useful construct, but increasingly it is the Indian Ocean that we now need to focus on. This will be the great cockpit as we move forward. Secondly, I would suggest to you that what we're witnessing is something truly profound historically, and that's that while the Middle Kingdom construct prevails, that China is the center of the universe, what the Chinese are doing is something that they've never done before, and that's that they are beginning to move outwards in a sort of imperial way through the Belton Road, into the Indian Ocean, into Africa, into Eastern Europe, and so forth. They've never done this in the history of Chinese civilization. They've always been content largely to be inward-looking and persuaded of their own superiority. So this has put them on a collision course, not only with the United States, but with India, and we can see that unfolding. Thirdly, I would suggest that ASEAN, the Association for Southeast Asian Nations in the southeastern quadrant of Asia, is roadkill. It is irrelevant. The Chinese have completely subverted it by money politics. And Mohan made reference to Cambodia, and we could go on with other examples. The Philippines, Malaysia, all in fact corrupted. The idea, ironically, that ASEAN is a community occurred at the very moment that ASEAN ceased to be a community. They are deer in the headlights. And we've seen this play out in the rather pathetic response to Chinese adventurism in the South China Sea. And we can see it further if we go into the Indian Ocean, that what the Chinese have done in the South China Sea, they're beginning to do, whether it's in Sri Lanka or whether it's in Pakistan or in the Maldives or in parts of East Africa. We need to be very alert. As Mohan suggested, I think the Western liberal community was profoundly wrong in the sense that they thought that as the Chinese economy grew, China would become more, quote, reasonable, unquote, more like us, easier to deal with. In fact, the very reverse has been the case, and I would suggest to you that my fourth observation is that in the past half-decade, perhaps a little more than that, there has been a sweeping change in tone in Chinese foreign policy. Deng Xiaoping was very sage, very pragmatic, peppery little Sichuanese survivor, and he said, build your power and lie low. But Xi Jinping is a very different sort of cat than Deng. And in fact, what we've seen is that Chinese foreign policy has become increasingly arrogant, increasingly assertive, increasingly worrisome. Not only in the foreign policy realm of hard power, but in what's called sharp power, that is, for example, leveraging Chinese influence to prevent governments from entertaining the Dalai Lama, for example, or university presses from publishing articles critical on China, and soft power. And I would draw your attention to the work of a Professor Brady in New Zealand. Her work is called Magic Weapons, a fascinating analysis of how the Chinese have penetrated domestic politics. So I don't want this to be a hard-over anti-Chinese commentary, but we need to be very much alive to the various dimensions of Chinese influence in the international community. The Quad has existed over an extended period of time. As suggested, it was first coined more than a decade ago by Prime Minister Abe. Now, of course, the circumstances are very different than when they were first advanced. So we need to reassess the Quad, India, Japan, the US, and Australia in a very different way. It is designed to contain China. We may talk about the promotion of democratic values, but the underlying text is to regulate the change in the overall strategic architecture of Asia. This is what we need very much to pay attention to. What we also need to pay attention to is that the domestic agendas of the various players are distinctly different. We can see that Prime Minister Abe, for better or for worse, sadly, I think is in electoral difficulty. We can see that Modi is stepping short in his anti-Chinese rhetoric because he's hoping to go to China later this year. We can see a quixotic dysfunctionality in Washington, which does not reassure our friends in Asia. And we can see that Turnbull is wrestling with the fact that the stern realities of the Australian scene are heavy dependence on the Chinese economy. So a few observations about what's happening in the Asia-Pacific region. Like Professor Litvak, I'd love to have more ships on the West, but that's been an uphill struggle for me to try to persuade some players in Ottawa that Asia is truly important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe. Please feel free to take a chair. At this stage, I'd like to invite Dr. Nagao and Dr. Litvak to come and join us on the panel. I'm going to reposition myself a little bit. Thank you. So I can see you. We'll be turning to the audience for questions in about 10, 15 minutes. So think a little bit about what you might want to say, and I'd love to call upon you. The first question, Dr. Litvak, I'd like to take to you. And I think Dr. Mudaliar did this beautifully in terms of painting a portrait of what threat strategically China poses in the region. In the region, we have seen responses come from various coalitions popping up almost organically. The East Asia Summit being one of them that Canada has recently joined. BIMSTEC is something that you see New Delhi concentrating on as a potential partnership, including Bangladesh, Thailand, and others. The South Asia Security, SARC Forum, South Asia Regional Security Forum is another coalition. Why is the Quad in your mind, or is the Quad in your mind, the antidote, the all-encompassing solution, or are there other options to the Quad?
I think that the organic response to China does not fit any particular Quad or any particular structure. I do not think there is ever going to be or should be anything resembling something organized like NATO. Okay? I don't want to minimize, it would be a grave mistake in this moment to minimize in any way the problem, but please notice that so far the Chinese have recruited only countries that are facing a much stronger neighbor they're in conflict with. Cambodia, they must have, because for Cambodia, the world begins and ends with Vietnam. Pakistan, they must have. And I wish them luck. We had a wonderful relationship with Pakistan as an ally. Now it's the turn of the Chinese to enjoy the Pakistani alliance. And I'm happy if they, I just hope they kick us out as soon as possible. So they are getting the countries that are threatened, and then they're getting highly corruptible entities. Like, for example, it was correctly mentioned, the Greek government. Okay, you can buy them; they're actually quite cheap, and you know, and for any purpose. But their point of view is a very common European point of view, namely that China is not our problem. China doesn't threaten us. Between us and China, there is the Russian Federation. Hence, for us, they're not a strategic problem. They are simply a source of investment, money, and all that stuff, and market. Therefore, the European attitude is, forget it. You know, we are not responsible. Since they're not responsible even for Europe, what they're going to do about non-Europe, even less. So why is the Chinese achievement not greater? Is because, as you know, any examination of history, very cursory, based on the most elementary examination, will tell you two things. The Russians are no good at nothing except strategy. That's why they own the largest country in the world and nobody gave it to them. They're no good at anything except strategy. Strategy, they are very good at. The Chinese, on the other hand, are good at everything except strategy. That's why throughout history, three guys on horseback showed up while two Chinese generals were exchanging quotes of Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu, whatever they call him. Then three nomads conquered China and ruled it for 200 years, okay? Things have not changed. I want to tell you that everything said about China, I do not want to minimize or underestimate. Admiral explained, it's all true and it's very significant and we need a response. But do remember that the Chinese foreign ministry doesn't function. The one country they try to have without its country needing them to protect them from a neighbor was Myanmar. And they lost Myanmar. They got booted out. Why? Because the Chinese embassy in Myanmar kept writing to Beijing saying, please don't pave over pagodas. You know, don't breach the sacred lake. But the letters get to the foreign ministry and they never reach the Politburo. Politburo is an autistic setup, okay? Now they want to name for the first time a diplomat into the Politburo, still not standing committee. It's a highly autistic regime, okay? And they do not get signals. And, you know, and their behavior so far is on track with their historical record. So, but of course we have to confront real realities like the transformation of islands. I do blame the Obama administration not to have done something about the transformation of the islands, if only on environmental grounds.
You're speaking about the South China Sea?
Sorry? You're South China Sea, the fact that, I mean, even the softest possible in strategic terms, just environmentally, they destroyed huge quantities of ocean reefs and these beautiful places. Some of us have been there. The environmental destruction alone should have evoked a response. There was no response. So there's been a failure to respond. There's a very belated reaction. And there is still very much the problem of, which was mentioned by a colleague who prefers the snow to Hawaii, is the fact that you could create an institute for the study of the misunderstanding of China. And being a very old guy, I would name it the Krishna Menon Institute for misunderstanding China.
Thank you for that.
So we must not engage in that, but we must also, I personally travel to China all the time.
Yes.
I've been going there for 40 years. And the one thing I want to tell you is absolutely no improvement in the quality of their ability to do foreign policy.
Interesting.
And the other thing that gives me great comfort is that Xi Jinping could not resist the temptation of abolishing the Chinese constitution, which only had one line that said 5 years yes, 5 years more, no more. And he changed, he abolished the constitution, which means we're going to get another flood of talented Chinese leaving China.
Thank you for that.
You know, thank you.
Thank you very much. I actually want to, you can hold on to your mic. I actually want to pick up on your point of the European conception of the threat and turn to Mohan. You mentioned that Europe looks at Russia as their major geopolitical rival.
No, the Europeans are now in light. Canada light is Europe light.
Correct.
Okay? And they have the representative, Mogherini, who was put there by the PD party of Italy. PD party of Italy is disintegrated. And Mogherini is the person who issues pronouncements about, you know, Bangladesh and Burundi and all that stuff all day long, and they do nothing, okay? When somebody like Putin acts and the response is to talk, the outcome is predictable.
Okay.
So we have Europe light,
right.
But moreover, only the British have their own peculiar interest in the Pacific area. Because of rather complex reasons, too long to elaborate on. But as I say, it might result in the sending of the aircraft carrier if the Singaporeans go through with their tacit promise of home porting and pay for the cost and so on. But the other Europeans' attitude is very simple. China is a threat to everybody except us.
So on that point, Mohan, I was curious, what do you think is the relationship between Moscow and Beijing? Is it one in which the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc has emerged in a different form in a new era? Is one state subservient to the other?
Well, in a complete reversal of roles from the 50s, when Moscow was a big brother and Beijing was supposed to play second fiddle, didn't play out well, did it? You know, so in a complete reversal of roles now, it's China that's a big brother, and Russia, post-Ukraine sanctions, has nowhere else to go. So Russia has, under Putin, has put all its eggs in the China basket. Russia is shrinking economically, demographically. This is the last hurrah of a very fast declining power. Russia's economy today is smaller than that of India's economy. India's economy is $2.5 trillion. Russia is $2 trillion economy. Post-Putin Russia, there could be a rupture. There could be, rethinking in Russia, in Moscow, as Dr. Litvak knows more about Russia or the former Soviet Union, there is this debate between whether you turn west or east, and Russia has turned east. But as long as Putin is there, I don't see any change. Russia has abdicated its responsibility or let China run all over in Central Asia. There used to be a time in Central Asia when all roads pipelines used to lead to Moscow. Now all roads, pipelines are being built, they lead to Shanghai or Beijing, So in a complete reversal of roles, China is a big brother. Moscow has no option but to play the role of play second fiddle to China. How long will this last? Going by Russia's history, it won't last forever. Let them enjoy while it lasts. So that's my take on it. Sooner or later, there will be change, but as long as Putin is there, I don't think there's going to be any change. In terms of one more point I wish to add, responding to Dr. Litvak's point about China wasting its resources in countries like Cambodia or Pakistan or Sri Lanka. That is true. There is a method to the madness. I mean, they've lost $15 billion in Bolivia, $15 billion in Brazil, $60 billion in Venezuela, $20 billion in Libya. Because of the nature of the political system, they can afford to lose. They've got very deep pockets too. But at the same time, what is the method to the madness? They are going in countries, investing in, say, Afghanistan, they have now got a base in northern Afghanistan, acquiring footholds in those countries that they believe are important to displacing the US. So just as, what was it that led to the colonization of Asia, Africa, and Latin America in the 18th and 19th centuries? It was not the white man's burden. It was a search for resources to fuel industrialization in Europe, markets to dump manufactured goods, and then came coaling stations which became bases, led to colonization. Resources, markets, and bases. That's what Mohan argued, right? These three always go together. You can't have one without the other. And that's exactly what is driving China's national security strategy. It's driven by the search for resources in Africa. You know, John Howard's book, Howard French's book on Africa, the second continent. Resources, markets, and countries that are located near maritime choke points. China wants to have presence in the Malacca Straits, Malaysia. They're building a city in Malacca City. Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Maldives, you know, Walvis Bay, Djibouti, Kenya, Lamu. So if you are a strategist sitting in Beijing, do not underestimate, you know, China's attempts to acquire maritime presence all along maritime choke points.
Thank you. And lucid advice to European and Western nations. I think you had an intervention, Dr. Litvak.
Just a very small point. Last September, I was in Vladivostok, and I met Putin there because he had an East Asian forum. And Prime Minister Abe of Japan came. President Moon, newly elected of Korea, came. And I asked Putin, I said, you know, good old Vladimir, I said, where are the Chinese? And he said, they offered us the usual very inferior person, so we said no. So there was East Asian Forum, Russia, yes, Japan present, Korea present, no Chinese. And that is how the Russians respond to the balance of power changing and preparing themselves, you know, for another phase. You know.
Thank you. I wanted to turn to actually Dr. Nagao. The Quad is emerging increasingly as an alternative, as a forum for a check against the rise of China's power, including Chinese collaboration with Russia, which, as you've noted, I think in your writing in the past, on island seizing exercises, the naval drills that the Chinese and the Russians have done together in the South China Sea, which is just even more defiant than defiant. What do you believe is the future of the Quad? How can the Quad accomplish deeper interoperability beyond maritime cooperation?
Firstly, of course, these four countries need to build more military capability ourselves, but at the same time, how to support small country is the agenda for us. Because, for example, last year, the Bhutan faced the Chinese invasion in the Dogran Plateau, which is a confrontation zone between China and Bhutan. But so both of them claim the territory, their territory in the Dogran. And India intervened to stop China's move. So from June to August, the two army in the India and China standoff has continued. But after that, it looks like China stopped moving in the Indo-China border area. But a few days ago, we see the new move of China. During the winter, China make the new route to enter the Dogran, and they have already been. So China's move looks like that. So how to react to Bhutan is, this time, Bhutan hasn't asked India to help. Why? Because Bhutan is a small country. Bhutan afraid of confrontation. So Bhutan does not have the courage to ask India to help this time. Such kind of situation easy to occur in the near future. One by one, the small country fall on China's side. Such kind of situation we should avoid. So how to support small countries? Professor Litvak mentioned about Vietnam. Yes, Vietnam, courageous country. 3 great power lost in this place. Vietnam's case relatively, Vietnam is hope, I think. But as a small country, when they face a serious situation, this Quad supports them to say, we need help. That is the situation we should create. That is the future goal we should create.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
You know, this contest of Doklam, Jim, is, I think, a lesser documented story. A year ago, as Dr. Nagao had said, the Indians came to the aid of their allies in Bhutan to check China's building of a road through the contested region of the Himalayas. That was the first time the Chinese abandoned an infrastructure project to an actual challenge. And of course, a year later now, in the last weeks, we're seeing that unravel again because of China's predatory practices towards these small states. In your mind, what do you believe the Quad can accomplish in coming to the aid of small states like Bhutan or Maldives or Sri Lanka? Do you think that there is ambition there that Canada could be a part of?
That's a, I think, ladies and gentlemen, you better go off and have lunch and then come back for the afternoon session because this could be a slightly longer answer.
In 30 seconds, please.
Let me come back momentarily to the point that Professor Litvak and Dr. Mohan were discussing about the Russia-China relationship. There are some powerful similarities between Xi and Vladimir Putin. The deep, entrenched paranoia that they both entertain about the way the rest of the world is orchestrated. And in fact, what we see in the Moscow-Beijing relationship is a marriage of convenience, that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But I would suggest to you that both Putin and Xi have made a very careful and apt assessment of the passivity of the outside world. And we can see that in the carborundum strategy that they pursued in the South China Sea and Putin's little green men in the eastern Ukraine. Both of those are textbook examples of operating just below the threshold of outright hostilities and, in fact, with the aid of disinformation and other strategies, they have been able to continue to paralyze the Western response. So when it comes to the Quad, there are several things. One is that people have actually got to stand up and be counted. And that's what Modi did with Doklam 1. When the Chinese began to press, he actually put troops into the region. And the Chinese were a bit stunned. Now, it was also a question of timing because the Chinese were about to host a major diplomatic meeting, and they didn't want to have egg on their face having this hanging over the meeting deliberations. So they backed off. But we have to stop deluding ourselves because the Chinese have become past masters at looking shark-eyed and banging on the desk and people roll over and blow away. And they've discovered that this is a very effective strategy, and they've done it time after time. Look at Sri Lanka, for example. The Chinese moved into Sri Lanka and they built a port in southeastern Sri Lanka called Hambantota. And this was a source of deep anxiety in New Delhi that this was a potential naval base for the PLA and the Chinese Navy in the future. Well, the Sri Lankans woke up one day and discovered that they couldn't possibly pay back the Chinese. And so what they had to do was enter into a debt equity swap where, in fact, the Chinese took over Hambantota, or 80% of the facilities, on a 99-year lease. The same strategy, the carborundum strategy, wearing down your opponent bit by bit by bit, or in the case of Pakistan with the China-Pakistan economic corridor with probably upwards of $50 or $60 billion invested, the Pakistanis are going to find themselves up to their necks in debt to China. Now, I think that may be a sort of reverse blessing, as Professor Litvak suggested. I don't think I'd want to hang Pakistan on anyone's shoulders, but that's what's going to happen. Now, what about Canada? Canada's got to get serious. Either it's an Asia power or it isn't. And we've got enormous links with Australians. Australians are great guys. They're really muscular. They get on with getting on. What we're seeing in Australia is the biggest military and naval modernization since World War II. Here in Canada, we're flanneling around rhetoric, words, and no action. Now, one can argue the Australians are in a tougher neighborhood, but the fact remains that the Australians, when the push comes to shove, in many cases discourage greater Canadian involvement in the region because they say, Canadians aren't real. They never turn up. Or if they turn up, they're gone the next day. And one has only to look at the lamentable, the pathetic Canadian performance in Da Nang with the TPP, or revised TPP, which deeply embarrassed Prime Minister Abe. I thought that was an appalling slight to a colleague and friend. And
not just to Japan, but also to all of Southeast Asia that was hinging on this deal.
Precisely. To leave Abe at the altar, I think was terrible. And then 2 weeks later, Justin Trudeau is in China and the FTA collapses. And then he goes to India, and that's an absolute disaster. My own reading, I don't have inside information, is that Modi probably took pity on them, and on day 6 of the biblical 7-day visit, he, in fact, actually, you can see the sort of body language. He's going like this. He's going through the motions in order to save Trudeau's face. But I mean, who advised? Well, I'm going off on a rant, but...
no, continue, it's great.
Whoever was in the Prime Minister's office should be hanging by his thumbs.
I appreciate it.
We have got to get serious. When the Chief of Defense Staff was nominated, Jonathan Vance was a one-time student of mine. And I took the liberty of sending him a cold call email saying, now that you're about to become the Chief of Defense Staff, these are the issues that you really have to address in Asia. You have to be consistent. You have to show up. Sometimes you'll go all the way to the other side of the world and you'll come away 4 or 5 days later and you'll say, why did I bother doing that? It was a complete waste of time. But if you didn't show up, it would be noted. And we have to put real substance. I mean, one has only to look at Mali. We have to have real substance, not rhetorical substance. And the assistance to small powers is critical, but it has to be prioritized, has to be effective in order to counterbalance, because the Chinese arrive with suitcases of cash, no questions asked. They're not interested in female representation, they're not interested in the lesbian agenda, they're not interested in greater democratic performance. They just want a port, an airport, and they pay for it, and they're gone, or almost gone. And so we have to get serious. Are we in this business or not?
Thank you very much. I think that's a great call to action for Canadians. I have 2 very quick questions for these 2 gentlemen, and I'd love to turn it to the floor. First is to Dr. Malik. We've seen India develop new partnerships with the UK and France in the Indo-Pacific. Can you give us a short assessment of what you think those latest agreements are?
Okay, let me first provide the context why India is reaching out to countries, has reluctantly, it was a very reluctant partner in terms of inviting Australia to the Quad. The context is that this may turn out to be China's imperial overreach, but the harsh reality is that the major thrust of China's Belt and Road or One Belt, One Road initiative is the Indian Ocean region now. Having consolidated its position in the South China Sea through fake islands, China is now increasingly going into the Indian Ocean. On a regular, they have deployed submarines, nuclear-powered submarines. There are about 10 to 14 ships deployed in the Indian Ocean. China has acquired 20% of Cambodia's coastline on lease for 99 years. It's pressuring Myanmar to lease Chakpu port for 99 years. This was supposed to be a 50-50 joint venture, and China was supposed to have only 50% stake, but now China has proposed to Myanmar that if it doesn't want to pay penalty of close to $1 billion for reneging on that deal to build Mitsone Dam in 2011, now the one solution out of that problem, not paying the penalty, is to give China 99-year lease. India and Japan are also building ports. Japan is building Tawai port in the Bay of Bengal for Burma, and India has completed construction of Sitwe port in Myanmar. But their terms of construction, they don't have lease, long-term leases like China is asking for, 99-year lease. Hambantota 99-year lease. They have acquired a base in the Maldives, 50-year lease. Gwadar 40-year lease. Djibouti 15-year lease. So next is Lamu in Kenya. So what is India doing? India has launched a 3-pronged strategy. One is to move closer to Japan and the US. They signed a logistics exchange memorandum of understanding that provides US Navy access to Indian ports and airports. Likewise, India gains access to US ports in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's in Djibouti or Diego Garcia or in the Pacific Ocean. Next was Singapore. They signed a similar LAMOA logistics exchange agreement with Singapore. And recently, during French president's visit to India, India signed a similar exchange agreement. And next is Japan. That would provide Indian Navy access to French islands, French-owned islands, bases in the Indian Ocean, in the South Pacific, and if Japan and India sign one, then Japan could gain access to Indian ports, and likewise India could gain access to Japanese ports. It would make perfect sense. India and Vietnam have very close ties. So Seychelles Island, Mauritius, Madagascar, Oman, Maldives, they have a signal intelligence space tracking facility, Indian Navy. So India has embarked upon this, this outreach, naval outreach to great powers as well as to Indian Ocean littoral states. And third is India is trying to expand its naval fleet from 135, though you cannot compare, the rate of Indian naval expansion with China's. Nobody can compare with China. China is going to have the largest navy, 500 ships. By 2025, 2030, if they are able to, unless there is an economic crisis, major slowdown, and everything turns out to be, a short-term expansion, just as the Soviet Union was seen in a very expansive mode in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s. But if it lasts, this is the biggest challenge. And to counter one belt, one road, we need order based on rules. That's also Ober, order based on rules. And that's poison kills poison. So to counter Ober, we need order based on rules, and the Quad is a very small effort. We need, at the global level, a broader coalition of democracies to uphold it.
Thank you very much. Professor Litvak, what is going on in Washington? Is there American strength? Is there American strength in Asia still, in the Indo-Pacific region? Is it increasing? Is it declining? What are the facts beyond the Twitter type of atmosphere that we're in?
Well, it's a very legitimate question because American mass media have ceased to deliver information about wars, peace, earthquakes, floods. They talk about, American media don't talk about the world, they talk about, Trump's lawyer or whatever. The fact is that Trump, since entering the White House, has been trying to keep his electoral promises, one by one, like a little train, station by station. The reason Tillerson had to go is because the next station after the current one is Iran. He promised he's going to revise the Iran agreement. French president agrees. The French were very reluctant about the agreement, whether they succeed or not. But basically, unless the judges in the courts stop Trump, unless the Congress won't pay for something, he's determined to fulfill his promises, one by one. So he got this tax agreement through. People have been trying to do that for some 35 years. He did it. He promised that he would impose tariffs to protect the steel industry. He promised to the steel workers. He did it. So basically his line is keeping promises. In fact, the very first promise was to revoke the TPP, because the TPP meant that the United States would be greatly advantaged in selling services provided by the middle class and upper middle class that didn't vote for Trump, at the expense of losing on the trade side, the hard trade side, which is provided by the Trump voters. So the action of Trump has been entirely coherent. It is masked by this cloud of tweets on his part and foolish divagations here and there. I mean, the guy behaves like a fool in every respect except in fulfilling his program, like a little train, station by station. The current station is called China. And his idea is that without any hostility whatsoever to Xi Jinping, or to China without relating it to the strategic engagement, different subject, which is being handled by the Pentagon's budget increase. The budget increase of the Pentagon is the same as the total budgets of every country in Europe, as far as I can tell, and is dedicated to maritime purposes, maritime, not army, not anything else, maritime. So his attitude to China is, when you enter the WTO, you're a poor country. You therefore obtain privileges, like joint ventures with technology sharing, and also we overlook the theft of intellectual. This is ending. And he told Xi Jinping, and the Chinese answer, oh, we're going to retaliate and so on. In fact, Trump is going to go through with it. And you will notice that the only support Trump ever had in the pages of the New York Times related to his current China initiative. That's the only thing he did. That is the theft of intellectual property, but mainly, forget about the theft, is the simple fact that you do a joint venture in China, you have to share the technology. That will end, and he has support for that. So I mean, I do understand that, you know, porno stars, Stormy, I'm a great admirer of the Stormy, by the way. I'm interested in sex, but I'm not interested in pornography. But I looked at, I say he's a remarkable person, but the fact is that the Trump activity is very coherent. It's not the activity that the upper middle classes approve of. And his attitudes are not the attitudes of the upper middle class. He is the populist, and the word populist now means somebody who listens to the common people. As you know, everybody in European politics is outraged because when Chancellor Merkel invited 1 million people to move to Germany and forgot to ask the Germans what they thought of it, naturally, you know, you get what is called the populist reaction. When the leaders of democratic parties, the Democratic Party leaders, prefer to maintain their personal reputations in, you know, politically correct circles, in progressive circles, liberal circles, humanistic circles, to listening to the people will find others. That's called populism. Populism is not the negation of democracy, it's the affirmation of democracy. And Trump is living in the middle of this, and his refusal, systematic refusal, to have a cohesive and clear-cut foreign policy is highly deliberate. The reason Mr. Tillerson had to go is because he reflected the common opinion in the State Department that the United States should not renegotiate the Iran agreement. Now, I don't have a position on this, but during the campaign, he kept saying he would do it. Americans appear to have voted for him for saying that he would do it, and this is typical of what's going on. And in the midst, since the ambassador of Japan is present, there is the fact that the only country that Trump considers to be a strategic and organic ally of the United States that counts for something is Japan. And he's made that very clear through it. But of course, he couldn't agree with things like TPP, but he's made that clear as well. So there is a lot of coherence. His attitude to India, by the way, is only second to Japan. But Trump, just to give you a little side remark, when Trump met Modi, he raised the issue of BRO. Do you know BRO? BRO, which is the greatest ally of China, is called BRO. It's the Border Roads Organization. They're the people in charge of building all the roads in Arunachal Pradesh and the front areas, where the Indians are challenged by the Chinese. So you have 80,000 Indian soldiers, and behind them you have a twiggy-twaggy mud little road, and it's kept by the BRO, right? So in other words, Trump said to him, are you going to fix BRO? Can you put in proper people so that troops have trucks can reach their forward bases instead of not reaching them? And so on and so forth. In other words, there is an element here of seriousness behind the cover. But Trump is not a victim of the evil media, because he himself deliberately provokes these confrontations, and gets involved. And if there's a failure of having a scandal on Monday, by Tuesday he'll find one to do.
Thank you so much.
Provide just a quick follow-on to that.
Please.
If we look at the Indo-Pacific region, I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that what we see is the prevalence of hedging. That is to say that almost all the countries, large and small, in the Indo-Pacific region have China as their #1 trade partner. But they all, at the same moment, want to have the United States as their #1 security partner. And we can see a very muscular debate, for example, unfolding in Australia about the balance, striking the balance between keeping China on side as a trade partner while challenging China in the security realm. The lack of predictability in contemporary Washington politics is a source of deep angst, I think, throughout the region. Even when we had the Pacific pivot under Obama and under an activist Secretary of State and so forth in the form of Hillary Clinton, we found that many in Asia were terrified that they were going to wake up one day and find the Americans gone. So now the situation has been exacerbated at the very time that the Chinese are becoming more assertive. So the revocation of the TPP on day 3 of the Trump administration was in many ways symbolic of a perception of American decline and lack of reliability as a security partner in the region. Now, grown-ups like General Mattis and others have tried to reassure, but there is this constant subtext and anxiety about what's happening in Washington that it's going to reflect in a lack of willingness of the Americans to actually come to rescue beleaguered Asian friends and relations.
It's a fascinating conversation on calculated unpredictability and how effective it is in the Indo-Pacific region. But I don't get to ask any questions anymore. I'm now going to turn to you guys. We have about 30 minutes and lots of interest. So what I'm going to ask is that I'll call upon 3 of you at a time, and then we'll put it to the group. If you can keep both the questions tight and the answers even closer, then I think we can get through a lot of good conversation here. So we'll start with you, sir. We'll turn to you, and then just behind you, sir. And then we'll come to you the next round. Try and, I don't think I can get the mic out to you, so if you don't mind projecting, or I'll repeat it.
My name is Edward Litvak. I'm an aerospace engineer, so forgive me if I think outside of the box. I tend to think from orbital heights, so I'm very far out. And I look at this planet and I notice a few things. The first thing that I notice is that I sense that there is a lot of magic energy that is pent up in such a huge reservoir and is ready to burst. And if it is possible to channel that energy into something that is useful, especially when we are talking about the Belt and Road project that China is embarking on, could we extend that into a highway to the planets and put these resources into something creative instead of building ships and aircraft carriers, etc.?
Thank you.
Is that a possibility?
Thank you very much. I think we said we were going to come to you next.
My name is Akash Maharaj. I'm from the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption. Thank you for your presentation. My favorite part was hearing the novelty of hearing Donald Trump described with the adjectives serious, coherent, and exotic. But putting that aside, you've made the compelling argument that China has been projecting its power and its influence across the globe in an attempt to remake the international system in its own image, or at least in its own interest. And you've also suggested that the Quad could be a barrier to this, or at least a counterbalance, and that strikes me as being possible. The one part that I feel some misgivings about were the opening statements that Canada, its rightful place is at that table. My question to you is, given Canada's foreign policy and foreign posture towards China as it is, rather than as you would like it to be, which strikes me as being not unsympathetic to China and averse to risking political capital or economic opportunity, do you really think that Canada has something to add to the Quad? And if the answer is no, what do you think would require to happen within Canadian public opinion to bring about changes in foreign policy so that Canada would have a contribution to make to the Quad?
Thank you. Okay, and one more question.
Well, it's a pity that no one from the panel mentioned about the name Taiwan. Actually, Taiwan is a democracy. It's in the first island chain, and it's well, you have to know that Taiwan is probably the only country knows China the best, and it's the front line of Chinese aggression, soft power, hot power, whatever. So, any comment on what Taiwan can play the role as a supportive to the Quad alliance? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, channeling energy and infrastructure to better ambitions, Canada's true place in the Quad, given its position on China. And what about Taiwan? I'll throw it to the panel. Who wants to go first? Dr. Litvak?
Only Taiwan. Okay. 20 million people, 22, whatever the population is. High GDP, and it's an island. It's an island. It's not a peninsula. Therefore, with a minimum of seriousness, I don't mean a maximum, Taiwan can make itself non-conquerable. That means having defense primacy capabilities, stop trying to acquire warships and things that look like other people's warships and fancy aircraft, and instead make the island unconquerable. With today's technology, given Taiwan's money, this could easily be done, but it does require seriousness. And there is a cultural obstacle. The current defense minister of Taiwan, Mr. Fang, is a very capable, very intelligent person, highly capable. But his attempts to move the military organization from ape-like imitation of great power army, great power navy, and so on, to move them towards relevance is making very little progress. So it is a question that you face if you are serious about protecting Taiwan. This is very easily done, but it does require engagement. So it is something like the BRO situation. Everybody knows that the Indian position in Doklam, Arunachal, and so on. The Indian government did the honor of asking my thing, and my recommendation was to stop all tourist traffic on the Darjeeling road. Because when the Darjeeling tourists go up to Doklam, the army trucks of India cannot move at all because the road is terrible, very narrow. So we need, one of the things that is needed is a little bit of down-to-earth practicality. When the Chinese see people not doing those simple things, they say they're not serious.
And the United States seems to be very serious about deepening its partnership with Taiwan.
Well, that is not something I view with any favor whatsoever, because that has a tendency of reinforcing the attitude of pretending to playing soldiers, playing sailors, playing airmen. When you meet up with the Americans don't come and recommend Taiwan appropriate defenses. They don't do that, okay? And when the Americans finish visiting Taiwan, the Taiwan Air Force wants to have F-35s, okay? And in other words, in some places in the world, countries like Switzerland, the population expects the government to protect them against anybody. Even when Switzerland is surrounded by the Nazis and the Axis alliance, they expect the government to protect them. And what does the government do? Serious things, like, give a rifle to every Swiss. You see the invader, shoot him, okay? So, and other governments, other things are playing at this. If Taiwan feels threatened, they should get serious. And the United States is not what they need. They need themselves to become serious.
Thank you. Any other comments?
Yes, I mean, Taiwan has some strengths. Japan and India have launched Asia-Africa Growth Corridor that also responds, in response to your question. There's a huge demand for infrastructure development in the developing world, especially in Asia and Africa, Southern Asia and Africa. China is investing because Chinese state-owned enterprises have deep pockets. But Japan is an old player. Japan is contributing $35 billion to India's infrastructure development alone, There's a huge demand in Africa too. Taiwan, Japan could be contributing to Quad's efforts. The first Quad meeting in Manila talked about connectivity projects that they can identify and cooperate to build together, provides in different narrative, different kind of development financing for these projects that does not lead to huge debts, that leads to countries surrendering their sovereignty. So different type of model. Japanese loans come with very low interest rates. Chinese loans come with 4 to 8% of interest rates. And that creates problems, because the objective is different. They want countries heavily indebted to China so that they can acquire ports, air bases. But Japan's model is different. India, other countries, Canada, South Korea, Taiwan could bring a lot to these countries by pooling their efforts, coordinating together to build infrastructure in those countries.
Perhaps I could turn to our colleague here. We've tended, I think, implicitly or explicitly to suggest that the rise of China is inexorable. And the Chinese do, in fact, embrace a sense of triumphalism that America has reached the point of decline and that the rise of China will continue. But I would suggest that it's very important for us to focus on a series of truly profound structural weaknesses in China. And one of them, it comes back to the question of the environment. The environment in China is a mess. It's appallingly bad. Now, the Chinese have publicly offered or contributed, put up hundreds of billions of dollars to address this problem. Now, partly it's because the party realizes that if they don't address the problem, they are going to suffer deep, deep erosion of their popular base. But this is an issue where, leaving aside Mars, leaving aside the world from 100,000 feet, we've got some real challenges here on planet Earth. And the Chinese are attempting to address it, if only by desperation. If we looked at the sort of global roster of monies allocated to environmental remediation, Chinese would probably be towards the top, partly because, as say, they have perhaps some of the biggest challenges. But these challenges could constitute a significant break on the upward trajectory of China. So watch this space. There's a wonderful book by a woman with the classic name of Elizabeth Economy, and it's called The River Runs Black. It's now becoming an old-fashioned book. It was published, I think, in 2004, but it, in fact, gives you a powerful insight into how appallingly bad the Chinese environment is.
Thank you. Dr. Nagel.
It is no doubt Taiwan is very important. Taiwan is, if China, if Taiwan was fallen, today China can expand their influence in the Pacific side, that's true. And Taiwan is also the important player in South China Sea. And China tried to isolate the new Taiwan leader now because she did not follow the China's rule. So currently, in Washington, there are many Taiwan-related conferences now because U.S. focus on Taiwan, I think. So how to support, because the military, economically, there are many options. In this case, we need courage. But that is the only matter. Maybe Taiwan side prepared to accept many support, I think. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to do another round of questions. Maybe I'll increase them because I see a lot of interest in the audience to maybe 5 or 6. I'll start with you, sir.
Thank you all for your presentations. China considers itself a near-Arctic country, so I'm wondering if you could comment on China's interest in the Arctic and what it means for Ottawa.
Great question. I'll start with, oh, yeah, sorry. Your hands seem dislocated. Yes,
thanks. I wonder if you could address, does there have to be a confrontation? I'm hearing of Thucydides' trap type. There must be containment of China. And I sort of, you don't inevitably end up with America has 400 forward operating bases. China will insist on rebalancing to where it was, and you're going to end up in a confrontation. And within that, some questions about American leadership. Is it coherent, or is it a kind of a chaos type approach that is more Russian lately. It's a question of how it can play out. If I could throw in a further subset. The Australians developed a nonpartisan consensus on engaging China. It's a little bit schizophrenic. One of you pointed out that they have addressed the security relationship was primarily with the U.S., the trade relationship that is first with China, and they now have troubles. Is that a model that could work for Canada? Because we've never managed that. The closest we came to a China policy in the last 15 years was just about 4 years ago today, and the cabinet walked away from it. So we have a tough time thinking whether we can engage.
Thank you. Thank you. Great question.
Richard Curran. I'd just like to, I know this is a very much an Asia-Pacific, Indian Ocean focused event, but I'd like to come back to something that Dr. Litvak mentioned earlier in his opening remarks. He seemed to dismiss the danger of Mr. Putin in Europe and suggested that Canada could focus its efforts much more profitably on the Pacific. Seems to me that we're facing two dangers. We're facing certainly a real and present danger in Europe. I personally don't think that Mr. Putin is through by any means in his adventures. At the same time, we're facing the kind of thing we've been discussing this morning in Asia. So we're really talking about a two-front situation, which couldn't be worse for us, because Canada has limited resources, not to speak of the resources that the Europeans and even the Americans have, to try and divide those resources into two separate theaters, which conceivably could be joined at some stage. I just think we need to bear that in mind when we think about the threat of China. We must keep in mind that the Russians are also something that could be a danger to us.
Thank you very much for that question. Certainly.
I'd like to come back to the issue of China's challenges, specifically economic challenges, since that's a foundation of their performance. And I'd be very interested in your thoughts about the relationship between how China is going to have to resolve its economic challenges and its external performance. Let me just make 2 points clear what I mean by economic challenges. Very briefly, because there are many interpretations, as you know, for China. Number one, their growth, 6.5%, is really not a performance. It's a target under the system, number one. Number two, growth is driven by debt, very high debt. The issue is not debt to GDP. The issue is performance. A lot of it is bad investment. Ghost cities being an example of that. To resolve that is a political issue. Transfer of power from state enterprises to households and small and medium-scale enterprises. OBOR is perhaps partly an attempt to address that. So my question would be, these are issues that have to be resolved. How do you see the relationship to the external strategy?
Fantastic question. Finally, ma'am. Yeah, go for it.
No, sorry.
Thank you. Actually, people here talk about the threats and the challenges to deal with China. And thanks for the insightful the speeches and comments by the speakers. Actually, I like to make a comment about what the root cause of the challenges we worry, right? And why China and Taiwan so different. And so if China is like Taiwan, so are we going to sitting here have this topic? But actually I think the root cause is because China is a communist country, the regime. And the communist ideology, I think, is the root cause of all. And I think when you talk about Asia Pacific, China related, and it's really, really important to realize what is communism, because that's really the driving force for its behavior in China and overseas. And why China is so aggressive, like soft power, hard power, the trade and everything, right? And so to globally, and it's kind of a bully. So yeah.
What's your question?
So I don't know, have you heard about the movement of creating the CCP in China? Because there's a very important publication by the Epoch Times called 9 Commentaries on the Communist Party that's published in 2004. And since then, inside China, there's a massive movement. It's kind of quiet movement. And the people started to quit Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations. And I think by this month, the number will reach 300 million. I think that's really offer the hope of China, because China's change will not only good for China and also for all the world.
I really appreciate the comments here, but I have to preserve time for everybody else. I'm going to do a quick summary as quickly as I can of the 5 questions that were raised. China as a high Arctic nation, that makes little sense logistically, but a very profoundly important question. The second is, does confrontation have to happen? Do we have to have a contest with China? The third would be, Canada is in a position where we have 2 theaters. Can we afford it? How do we prioritize our way through that? The fourth is China's own economic performance. Could it collapse, or does it have great potential? And finally, China's communist ideology. Can it be replaced, and is there some sort of movement within that could replace it? So I tried my best to summarize it. Pick any one of those. I'm happy to start anywhere with a volunteer. Dr. Malik, why don't we start with you, and then we'll turn to John.
Let me respond to a couple of those questions. The Chinese Communist Party is a big challenge. If China were to become like Taiwan, we wouldn't be discussing many of these problems that we are talking about today. It will deal with, just as Taiwan has dealt with the South China Sea in a different, very different format. The way India dealt with PCA verdict on its maritime boundary dispute with Bangladesh, which went against India, but it accepted it, and China would not accept it. So I made this point earlier that regimes that do not share power in domestic politics, do not abide by the rule of law, will not abide by the rule of law in international politics. So that regime type matters. And let me now respond to the other question about China's economic problems and what if there is any Chinese economic collapse. China has to date, over the last 3 decades, defied the laws of economics. The Chinese Communist Party has been able to insulate Chinese politics from China's economy. A tremendous feat. I mean, everything that Marx said, this is very un-Marxian actually, non-Marxian, that you separate politics from economics. And this is the first decade, after 3 decades of high growth, double-digit growth, that China's economic growth rate is slowing down. But that in itself poses a challenge. How do you resolve this contradiction between Chinese politics and Chinese economy? When other countries face that challenge, Japan went into prolonged economic stagnation. Japanese prime ministers would come and go on annual basis through revolving door politics. Japan had a political system that could cope with prolonged economic crisis, economic stagnation. Chinese political system is geared to promoting economic growth, 6 to 8%, 10%. Chinese political system is not geared to coping with prolonged economic crisis. And whenever Chinese Communist Party has faced domestic crisis, it lashed out at its neighbors. During the Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, then transition, Vietnam, teaching Vietnam a lesson. So the risk lies in the fact that Xi Jinping, that's why Xi Jinping has done away with 2-year term. He realizes all these companies, Anbang and other companies, are failing.
Is President Xi communist?
There are not many communists in the Chinese Communist Party, They're all capitalists, actually. Chinese Communist Party rules China because of capitalist policies it has pursued. It's a state capitalism. It's a very different kind of. So the risk lies in the fact that China faces a prolonged economic stagnation and it lashes out. That's why you see the rise of hyper-nationalism, identifying enemies. They are out to contain China, prevent China's march to glory and greatness.
Thank you.
So that's
very good. No, you took on 2 of those questions. That's fantastic. I see Edward having something to say.
On the Arctic, the Chinese have activated, as you know, they've acceded to the Chinese have acceded to membership of the Svalbard Treaty. Svalbard is the only actual place that you have access to what you might call the pole, where it's a nice place. There are hotels, restaurants, airports, and the Chinese, 22 countries have the right, including Japan, for example. Any Japanese is entitled legally to go to Svalbard if he can support himself, set up a business. In fact, you should. It's a beautiful place. There's excellent seafood. But the Chinese activity in the Arctic, that some people might find funny, has had one of the consequences is one of the reasons the Russians are beginning to move against them. because they don't want the Chinese to enter the Arctic. What the Chinese have done, they accepted, they wanted observer status in the council, and small things they did was enough to get the Russians suspicious at them. That is, the balance of power works, whether people know it or not. You don't have to have great leaders to make it happen, it just happens, okay? The other thing about Mr. Thucydides was a nice guy, and he wrote a wonderful book. And the fact that he's now evoked as a trap, I mean, we must collide with China. Let me tell you, we avoided war with the Soviet Union in much more difficult circumstances when there was a great deal of, the whole of the Washington State Department had 2 people who knew Russian, okay? And the Russian side was, but we will definitely avoid conflict with China. We will avoid conflict with China. The problem is what happens in the interstitial space and all that stuff. Now, in regard to Xi Jinping, I have to say one thing. One of my favorite places is Victoria Island in Hong Kong. And in regard to Mr. Xi Jinping's communism, his sister has a beautiful house there. Nobody has a house in Hong Kong. They live in a small one-room apartment, but she has a house. And the house is not big, but the garden is quite big. And it's worth about $50 million. And so anti-corruption campaign of Mr. Xi Jinping, the next time you meet him, you should say, you're always looking for corrupt people. But please notice another thing. He removed a lot of big people, like Xu Jiangkan started and many others, and Boxilai, of course, and he removed them, and they lost, their families lost their homes when you lose your position, and they got thrown out, their sons and daughters were fired, and so on and so forth. But all these people have hundreds, sometimes thousands of followers. And Joseph Stalin, when Mr. Stalin removed somebody, all of these other people were shot. So they removed some big Bolshevik, then he would kill 5,000 people around him, his relatives, his friends, associates, and colleagues. Xi Jinping is not doing that. And he is now a kind of president for life. If you go to an insurance company, you'll discover it's not an insurable position.
Thank you. Excellent. Any more comments?
I think the point that Dr. Litvak referred to a moment ago is extremely important, and you produced an elegant question which wasn't properly addressed on corruption, or, well, it wasn't so much on corruption, but your institutional affiliation to corruption. Corruption is a colossal problem, and I know that's a sort of throwaway line, but colossal problem across Asia. It's the great cancer of Asia. And of course, one could argue that it also applies in many other parts of the world, but it is an enormous...
The Nigerians will dispute.
Yeah. But I always think of Churchill, who said that the Soviets knock on all the doors and rattle all the windows until they find one open, and then they invite themselves in. And that's how the Chinese strategy works in the Arctic. But I mean, that's a sort of throwaway line, but nevertheless, the fact remains that I think the Chinese do constantly maneuver to have a place at the table. They've used money politics as suggested in places like Svalbard. They're, I think, genuinely interested in the potential of natural resources in the Arctic.
May I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
The Kingdom of Denmark, which is spilling prosperity, was not willing to pay $72,000 to the Greenland, which is under the crown of Denmark, but an independent state. They refused to do it in order to provide the signal to the airport, okay? So the Chinese come along, okay? In other words, where the Chinese move in is not against strength, but against weakness.
Exactly.
Weakness of this kind, that the Greenland being under the Kingdom of Denmark, but not part of Denmark, means 2 pennies, okay? 2 pennies, and the Danes, right, who are exploding with affluence, refuse to do it, and now the Chinese come along, and now they are going to have a position at the airport, okay? This is the kind of nonsense that goes on.
One last quick observation. I think the Chinese actually see the Arctic as the canary in the coal mine in terms of climate change. The Chinese are going to get hammered by climate change. And if you think the environmental issues, lack of water and so on, are critical now, move forward another 20 years. But that's one of the reasons why they're interested in the Arctic.
Dr. Nagao, yeah.
Okay. And I will reply the question about Canada. We should think our order faced the challenge. So our system, we enjoyed faced challenge. So yesterday, I visited War Museum in Ottawa. And I understand that Canada contributes a lot to maintain order. So joining the law to maintain the order in the world is Canada's pride, I think. So this is a problem, not only for Japan, not only the country in the Indo-Pacific, but also Canada, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I want to thank the Japanese Embassy and Your Excellency for helping convene our group here together. Dr. Crowley, thank you for availing the Macdonald-Laurier Institute to continue to pioneer new ground when it comes to interesting debates, including Canada's place in the world, and in particular the Indo-Pacific. I appreciate your comment very much. I think it's a very elegant point to conclude this discussion on. Please come onto our website at macdonaldlaurier.ca, sign up for updates, come to more events, be part of our conversation. This is just the beginning of one. While you've been here, a lot of the conversation has been distributed on Twitter, so find us there as well. We're looking forward to engaging with you and Canadians across the country about a real discussion about what Canadian interests are in the world, and in a world that's changing so rapidly, and particularly in a region that's going through so much growth, and will be the center of gravity for global growth in the century to come. Please join me in thanking Dr. Satoru Nagao, Dr. Mohan Malik, Dr. Edward Litvak, and Dr. Jim Mudaliar for a tremendous conversation about the Indo-Pacific region. Thank you so very much. And finally, could my colleagues at the Institute please give a wave to the room? David McDonough, David Watson, I don't know if Allison or Amber or the rest of the gang are there. Maybe they're preparing. There they are. Could you please also give these guys a big hand of applause because they do amazing work. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll close the session. Have a wonderful day.
Gentlemen, can I get a group shot, please?